Good evening, everyone. I couldn't be happier to welcome you here tonight for a talk by Professor Neill Slaughter, who has really knows this wonderful period in the art world, and we're only too happy to be presenting something so much in your purview here. The exhibition Joaquín Sorolla, Esteban, Vicente in the Light of the Garden, just opened last week. We are thrilled to have been able to collaborate with the Sorolla Museum in Madrid and with the Vicente Foundation based here in New York to bring this exhibition to you. One taking up the same themes is now on view in Segovia, where the Museo Contemporáneo Esteban Vicente is. And such a wonderful idea that we collaborated on the theme and have the exhibition here as well. So, Sorolla being a little out of my purview, but I knew very, very well that Neill Slaughter would be such a fantastic speaker for us tonight. Neill, whom I've known for a long, long time here, because I've been here a long, long time on the old museum, yes, indeed. Has been a distinguished professor of fine arts at many wonderful institutions. I knew him best at Southampton College, Long Island University, and he has his BFA from the University of Georgia at Athens, his MFA from Indiana University, Bloomington, and as I say, we go back, I would say, quite a ways. I just want to point out one particular thing about Neill, as well as having received a Ford Foundation Fellowship, a Scottish Arts Council grant, an LMU Research Grant in Africa, and a Fulbright Fellowship to India. And I know those paintings of yours of those exotic places are some of my favorites. Beautiful. I do want to say that he is particularly close to our hearts because Neill, for I'm not even sure how many years, has been helping us when we have our annual student exhibition. We showcase the high school seniors who do portfolio work and are probably going on to careers in art. And you have come to judge those contributions every year. And I'd like to say that Neill, where were you born?
Well, I was born in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
June 4th.
Okay. But I
moved when I was about 6 months old to Annapolis, and my dad taught the neighborhood.
Okay, there you are. So Annapolis, Maryland I'm from Washington, so that's Southern. And I will just say that Neill, if he has something to say about somebody, it's going to be very nice and encouraging, which is what you have done with our students over the years. You've devoted hours and hours to reviewing those portfolios and giving each one such a contribution. Thank you. You probably might not have known that. I know his family knows that he disappears for entire days over here sometimes, every year, right? I would like to thank our sponsors tonight, our presenting sponsors, Bank of America, Weill Cornell Medical, and the Corcoran Group for bringing us these terrific programs on our Friday nights. Something every Friday, just check the website. So I couldn't be happier to welcome you.
Thank you very much for that very warm and beginning to my talk. Now, as I told Alicia, often when I present this lecture, it's to art students, and it's been places like the Florence Academy of Arts and the Figurative Art Conference in Miami and the Salmagundi Club, and these places where it's comprised primarily of artists. And so I'm sort of notorious for making short stories long, and I would wax and wane poetic about all of these paintings I'm about to show you. So I've cut this lecture down from easily 90 minutes to hopefully an hour, and we'd better get going. Without further ado. So, John Singer Sargent, Joaquín Sorolla, and Anders Zorn were all internationally renowned in their lifetimes, primarily as portrait painters, and that's how they made their bread and butter. But they also painted individuals of a wide array, and I have to read this because there's so many different. When they weren't painting self-portraits like you see here, they were painting their friends and families, fellow artists, actors, writers, poets, musicians, composers, philanthropists, politicians, bankers, industrialists, the aristocracy of Great Britain and Europe, and many other lords and ladies, including kings and queens, and all three of them painted US presidents. In short, they painted everyone that was anyone. This is a portrait of Violet Sargent, who happens to be the grandmother of Richard Ormond, who is the foremost authority. All right, Isabel, time's up. Richard Ormond's the foremost authority of Sargent that's still living. In fact, he has just curated a show that we're going to be going to in October. It opens, I think, October 2nd at the National Gallery of Art, called, coincidentally, Sargent and Spain. So I had sent him an email telling him about the show that's here with Sorolla. And when there was the big Sorolla show at the National Gallery in London a couple of years back, in 2019, I think it was, Richard Ormond presented he was in the film leading up, the little sort of 10-minute film that people would go see before going through the exhibition. Anyway, this is his grandmother, and that painting lives in the Fogg Museum. It's one of my favorites. I kind of like the way I put these two together. Where are you going to find the two ladies reading newspapers that happen to be the wives of the artists, Zorn and Sorolla? By the way, the one of Zorn's wife, Emma, that was one of the first oil paintings he actually painted. He really excelled in watercolor early on in his career and came to oil painting a bit later, and in all places, not in Sweden, but in St. Ives in Cornwall. They painted fellow friends and artists, and this is Dennis Bunker on the left, and on the right, Sargent would go all over Europe painting in his holidays, and he always had friends accompanying him, and none other than the Wilfred and Jane de Glen team. They seemed to just be like a team. They would go all over the place. That little painting lives in the Chicago Art Institute. And here we have the poet, Coventry Patmore, whose mug Sargent liked so much, he utilized him as a prophet when he was painting his Boston Museum murals. And he dressed him up to look like a prophet, which his murals were all about the history of religion. And on the right, we have Blasco Ibáñez, who is a very famous social commentary writer who influenced Sorolla a great deal, and I will show you some of those paintings that he did based on his writings. And of course, the philanthropist, Isabella Stewart Gardner. If you have not been to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, you owe yourself a treat to go there. It's like walking into a Venetian palace full of old master paintings, except for the ones that were stolen, and also these great Sorolla paintings, including El Jaleo, which is about the size of the screen. I'll show you that later on. Anyway, she became very good friends with both Zorn and Sargent, and these are portraits of her. The one later in life, Sargent just gave her that as a thank you gift because they became quite good friends. Politicians, that's the Prime Minister of England. Sargent had a knack for making people look better than they really looked in real life. I mean, he excelled at that. He would make them, in fact, let me go just back. Now see, I'm already deviating. See how elegant Coventry Patmore's neck is? I've seen a black and white photo. It looks just like him, but he has a stumpy little neck. Well, he's done it again. He's made him about 7 feet 5 inches tall, I think. But having said that, Nancy Astor was a great beauty, and she happened to be one of the first, if not the first, women in Parliament. She would hold these great soirees and fancy dinner parties in Cliveden, which is now a hotel. In fact, it's where Meghan Markle and Prince Harry stayed the night of their wedding. But when it was her house, she used to invite all the members of Parliament there, including Churchill. And I have a great little story to tell. Churchill loved to knock back copious amounts of champagne and or brandy. And at one point, he must have made some off-color remark because he was probably inebriated. And Nancy looked at him suddenly and she said, "Winston, if you were my husband, I'd poison your drink." And he raised his glass. He says, "Lady Astor, if you were my wife, I'd gladly drink it." So you've heard the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that's because we have chaps like Sir Frank Swettenham, who was colonizing Singapore. And then on the right, we have the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. It's kind of like the Downton Abbey story. Consuelo Vanderbilt marries into this land-rich but cash-poor Duke because they had just gone through so much of their money, keeping up the largest palace in Britain, which is the equivalent of Versailles, but in England. And it's in the beginning of the Cotswolds outside of Oxford. Anyway, that's Sargent's largest family portrait. There are bigger paintings he's done than that, but Consuelo sort of she's got the upper hand, it looks like. She's taller, standing up on the upper steps. And of course, she divorces him and comes running back to Southampton, where she finishes her days here. I have another story. The Duke's brother is Randolph Churchill, who incidentally dies of syphilis when he's about 48. But he marries Jenny Jerome, another American, and they are visiting his brother at the time in Blenheim Palace, and suddenly she goes into labor. So in November of 1874, young Winnie is born in Blenheim Palace, even though he was never meant to be, carry on the dukedom or anything like that, because his brother is the younger brother. So they also painted kings and queens, and this is Sorolla's painting of the King of Spain, painted outdoors on location, as he did almost all of his paintings. It's absolutely phenomenal what he could do. And that's not a small painting. It's 82. Most plein air paintings, these little things, because I paint in plein air as well. But there it is. And the King and Queen of Sweden, painted by Zorn, and of course painted indoors because Sweden is somewhat colder than sunny Spain. And all three of them painted U.S. presidents. Teddy Roosevelt was painted in 1903. He was introduced to Teddy, or Theodore, or President Roosevelt, through Mr. Henry White, who's an ambassador to London, that I'll get to because he paints his wife as well. But Teddy, being the gregarious fellow he is, he's taking Sargent around to all the rooms in the White House, and, should I sit here, should I stand there? And at one point, he was starting to take him upstairs, and he turned around, and Sargent just said, "Stop, we'll just do it right there." And he does this portrait, and it's still hanging into the White House today. The painting of Woodrow Wilson, given that it was painted during World War I, Sargent forgave his fee, and the money went towards the war effort to help the troops and the Red Cross. This painting of Grover Cleveland is in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I hope you get to see it. It's really fantastic in real life. Looks pretty good there, though, too. And there's Mrs. Cleveland. Now, here's a nice little comparison contrast. The sort of sunny, affable Sorolla painting President Taft looking rather jovial. Then I look at the Zorn, and it seems a little bit more stiff and stern. And Zorn was a very competitive fellow, and I think he was always trying to outdo Sargent, and I'm going to explain this a little further later on. Okay, ironically, all three eventually grew wary of the demands of portraiture, even though they all became internationally renowned because of portraiture. But they got tired of dealing with these pompous and prickly personalities. In fact, all three of them would rather paint their friends and family or relatives or even peasants because they were less judgmental. And they would paint them in scenes like this, and in kind of a loose handle, much more expressionistic manner, because they didn't have to deal with the high rollers of high society. Another unusual irony, though, is which sort of shocked me, is that by the time they died, and Sargent was the last to die at age 69 in 1925, shortly thereafter, all three of them fell into obscurity, and they didn't really come out of that. In fact, I was like a freshman in college when a brand new book, and a book on Sargent hadn't been written in years, Richard Orman wrote a book on Sargent. It was mostly black and white illustrations in those days, very few colored ones. But they fell into this obscurity because in the second half of the, well, beginning after about 1925, the aesthetic sensibilities embraced abstraction over naturalism. And so these guys were just old hat. But in their lifetimes, they were internationally famous. So between 1900 and 1910, in fact, Joaquín Sorolla was much more famous than his fellow countryman Pablo Picasso, who, of course, at that period, see that painting's painted in 1908, so he's already done his Demoiselles d'Avignon, but he was still not a well-known artist at this moment in time. And it was somebody like Sorolla here painting this 6-footer from life. And now I've forgotten because of the ringing in my ears. All right, so my lecture this evening is largely about a comparison and contrast of these 3 great Gilded Age artists. And of course, they weren't the only ones of the Gilded Age, but they're my personal favorites. And so what you're seeing here, and all 3 of them learned to draw and paint in a very similar manner in an academy. That's the way artists learned to paint and draw in those days. In fact, tonight we are being graced by David Kratz, who's the head of the New York Academy of Art, what I think is probably the best academy in all of America, right downtown New York City. Anyway, so they would learn to draw from these plaster casts and still lifes before they would move on to drawing from life and then move on to working out of doors on location. So what you have here are 2 drawings by Sargent when he's studying at Carol Duran's studio or academy. But in the middle there, that's a little painting, a little watercolor that he did because he was so precocious, and his mother was a pretty accomplished watercolorist. In fact, Richard Orman has told me that he's putting together an exhibition because she never had, and that's the way it was in these male chauvinist cultures, she never showed her own work in her lifetime. So he's putting together one with his son, of course, which will come about in the next couple of years. In any case, Sargent was born in 1856 in the winter, in January, in Florence. And you're thinking, well, he's an American. Well, what happened was she had had a miscarriage. His father was a doctor, and they came from New England. They were well-to-do. They came to Europe to kind of get away from it all because she had had this miscarriage. And they just end up staying, and they were like vagabonds. They didn't really settle anywhere. So when it was hot, they would gravitate towards the north, and when it was cold, they would come south, which is why in the winter, John was born in Florence. So by 18, after he had been drawing for a while, largely tutored by his mother, John was enrolled in Carol Duran's studio, academy, I should say, in Paris. And Paris was the art capital of the Western world. And also Duran's studio seemed to cater, there were a lot of Americans that studied there, and so maybe that's why he ended up there. Well, Duran liked to promote studying from the masters. Look at Frans Hals, look at Rembrandt, look at Velázquez. And he particularly championed Velázquez, so he would have his students, whenever possible, go off, and Sargent being the dutiful student, he went trooping off to Spain in 1879. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm looking at you instead of looking down. And he makes this copy of Las Meninas. The original one was painted 1656, 200 years before Sargent was born. But Velázquez had an enormous impact on artists that came thereafter. In fact, they did an incredible exhibition. I don't know how many of you saw it at the Met a few years ago on just how much Velázquez influenced just a plethora of artists that came on afterwards, including William Merritt Chase. Here's another painting by Velázquez after Sargent, and the only reason I'm showing you that, it's not a particularly great rendition of it here, is because Sorolla did the same copy only a couple of years later. Don't forget, he's 7 years younger than Sargent, so he's always sort of following in Sargent's footsteps. So in addition to copying masterworks, Sargent, Zorn, and Sorolla would have been painting from live models, as you see here. That painting, by the way, is at the Met, and you can find it. It's usually behind glass in those storage areas in the American wing. And I've seen it out, I think, once when they had a big Sargent show at the Met, but usually it's in the behind glass. And if you look, this is quite a good, I could use my little pointer. It was probably paint, and I did the same thing. Artists do it all the time, especially when they're students. You paint over other paintings, and it's very thickly painted. It's not so thickly painted. It looks thickly painted because of the fact that it's probably built up under the layers underneath are showing through. Now, so they would do paintings like that, and of course he's standing in front of a stove because it was pretty cold in Paris in the wintertime. Then they would go outdoors and paint en plein air. And that's an excellent example when Sargent's about 18 years old, showing these atmospheric color effects. What do I mean by that? Well, you look at that tablecloth, it naturally appears, you just read it as a white tablecloth, dappled with that sunlight, and then you see that cool tone. Why is it cool? It's like the shadows, the blue shadows in snow. It's reflecting the ambient blue, cool light from the sky, and then when it drops over the edge, it turns what? That sort of yellow tone, that yellow, sort of yellow, Naples yellowish kind of tone. That's because the light bouncing off the floor of the gazebo back into that. So that's reflected light is what's happening there. Sargent and all of these guys learned these rules. I always say, learn the rules before you break or bend them. So Sargent pays homage to his teacher, Duran, himself a fashionable portrait painter, by painting a portrait of him. And Duran, of course, is flattered to be painted by him, especially when he enters it into the Salon of 1879, and he wins an honorable mention and garners all sorts of great press coverage. In fact, later Sargent portraits were often compared to, quote, this youthful genius, which is how he was explained in the press at one point. So besides studying the old masters, Sargent and others would have been exposed to contemporary art currently being exhibited in Paris at that time. So they'd be looking at Manet, Monet, and the other, and I'm going to say it, avant-garde, and they were very avant-garde in the 1870s, the Impressionists. But they also would have seen this chap, Bastien Lepage. He didn't live very long, but he made an enormous impact on artists studying at that time in Paris because of this naturalistic approach to his painting. This painting lives at the Metropolitan Museum. Everybody go see that and look at it up close, and you'll know what I mean by naturalism. Sargent puts that plein air naturalistic approach to practice when he paints a number of studies to make this painting called Oyster Gatherers, which used to be in the Corcoran Museum. It's now in the National Gallery of Art in DC. And you look at a painting and it looks very fresh and spontaneous. In fact, Sargent didn't always paint like that. Yes, he worked outside and painted on location, but he wouldn't have knocked that off in an afternoon. Instead, I've seen all sorts of studies he did of this. He would do these little pencil sketches. He would put together groups. So you might see that mother and child, the first two. Shall I point? These two together, and then he would do another grouping, and then he would put them together. In fact, I've seen two different versions. I think Boston has the other one. It's a smaller version. This little boy has dark hair in the other version. But so while it looks fresh and spontaneous and knocked off in this effortless manner, in fact, Sargent was very deliberate. All of these guys were. They could draw like nobody else, and they just would study before or they would do little studies before they would do these kind of paintings. He won, again, a big prize with this, an honorable mention. So he was having great success. He decided to go far afield, and he ends up going down to Morocco and Tangiers, and he's painting these sort of white-on-white village scenes in plein air, and he comes and he gets this idea that he wants to do something more exotic to enter the salon of the next year, and so he comes up with this Fumée d'Ambre Gris as exotic. She's taking the incense vapors. This painting normally lives in, I say normally because I was just up at the Clark Institute a couple of weeks ago, and it wasn't there, but that's usually where it's hanging on the walls, and it's a real tour de force white on white painting. So we have the portrait of Dr. Pozzi, a rather dashing dandy gynecologist in his snappy slippers. And he reputedly had numerous love affairs with his patients, including Madame Gautreau. In fact, he bought that painting from Sargent called The Toast when Sargent was doing a plethora of studies before he comes up with his famous painting I'm going to show you in a few moments. But this painting of Dr. Pozzi was the first painting Sargent shows outside of the Parisian or the Paris Salon at the Royal Academy of London to little fanfare. And then it goes to Brussels. And this is what they said there. Quote, well, I have to find my little quote here. There we go. While it has style and swagger, there is too much stylishness. It's too theatrical. It's affected. And like a glass of champagne poured too quickly, it contains more froth than golden wine. It's a pretty good quote. I mean, I'd be happy with that even if. Anyway, he then, still under the influence of the great master Velázquez, he goes, he's been in Spain already a couple of years, and he wants to say something about the Spanish dance because he really knew music, and he got to know a lot of composers and was good friends with De Falla, and anyway, he loved Spanish dance, so he was working on this, preparing a really big painting. Each time he gets a little bit bolder, a little bit bigger, only this time he goes huge. By the way, I've seen an exhibition devoted to this one painting, and the catalog has about 150 pages, and it's all studies for El Jaleo, and that's it, and it's about that size in real life. In fact, it might even be bigger. It's 11 and a half feet long. I think this is something like 16 feet across, something like that. Anyway, this painting, its enormous size and ferocious energy, took the Salon of 1882 by storm, where along with Manet's Bar Folies Bergère, which now is in the Courtauld Institute in London, that's the painting, if you know it, if you know your art history, the woman standing there and you're seeing what's reflected in the mirror, and you as the viewer are this man who's standing opposite her, and all these beer bottles and oranges and things are lined up on the bar. So that's the painting. That painting and this painting, by the way, Sargent became good friends with Manet. This painting became the talk of that salon. And as Richard Orman has written, quote, "It was a subversive work, elevating a low-life subject to the level of high art and painting it as a huge blow-up sketch. Sargent's bravura performance swept people off their feet," end quotes. The critics described it as, let me just go here, audacious, fantastic, fearless, stunning, original, reckless, preposterously clever, and regardless of its lack of finish, most critics agreed it was a tour de force. So now Sargent had really broken through, and he was having all sorts of great Parisian accolades heaped upon him. There, by the way, is a little, one of the many studies he did, and that's in watercolor, of the Spanish dancer. So as Sargent was a relatively still a young man at this point, he is not sure whether he's going to become a subject painter or a portrait painter. And he usually submits one of each to the Salon each year. And in this case, he submits Lady with a Rose, which actually is based on, the pose of her standing there like this, dressed in black, is based on a Velázquez painting called Calabasas. The lady, in fact, was someone that Sargent was having a romance with that went on a few years. Well, actually, it went through most of the decade of the 1880s. And Richard Orman told me he thought it was probably fostered by Louise's mother because she sensed Sargent was going to have a brilliant career based on what had occurred so far. In any case, it seems to have fizzled. She married an Englishman. She went off on a long, extended honeymoon. 18 months later, came back, and sort of like what's happened with COVID, she caught something, died. She was 22 or something. I'm sure everybody, if you know Sargent, knows this painting. It's one of my very favorite of all times. It's of his good friend Edward Boyd's children. And that's more or less a square painting, 87 by 87 inches. That was a radical composition and very eccentric to do something like this. If you go to the Museum of Fine Arts, they have it very cleverly displayed now. They have those giant Chinese vases hanging on, or sitting on either side of the painting that are portrayed there. Somebody found them somewhere and they put them out. While this is an interesting little side of anecdotal thing that Richard Orman told me, that while Sargent wouldn't have known at the time he was painting these girls, none of them married as they got older. The two that happened to be sort of enshrouded in the shadows actually had led rather troubled lives, and one of them even became institutionalized. But on a happier note, the little girl Julia that's sitting there with her dolly on the floor, she became a rather accomplished watercolorist, emulating her father, Edward Boyd, who, by the way, talked Sargent into exhibiting his watercolors, most of which he had never even framed or matted or anything. Up until 1909, Sargent was just doing watercolors for himself. Boyd, organizes the show at the Brooklyn Museum. They essentially buy every painting. That then ruffles the feathers of the MFA, who considered Sargent their boy because he was working on these murals in Boston. And so they mount a show in 1912, and they buy all of those paintings. Then we fast forward to 2000, when was that? It's like 2013, 14, whenever it was. They did this great show that was at the Brooklyn Museum, and then it went up to the MFA of the combination of those two great watercolor shows. So Sorolla's painting of his family also illustrates the influence that Velázquez still has. In fact, even the way that reflection of Sorolla with his palette sort of leaning in is very much like in Las Meninas, where you see in the background, the doors open, the lights behind, and you see that figure, I think it's the king, looking at Velázquez painting the children. Here's a great limited palette painting. I happen to particularly like this series that Sargent painted. Most painters, when they went to Venice, they were seduced by all the canals and all the reflections, and it's not that Sargent didn't paint those, but early on, he painted a lot in back alleys, and then he went inside and painted all these sort of mysterious interiors, and that's because he was still under the influence of Velázquez. And this is just one, because I don't have enough time to show you the 6 more that I usually have in the lecture. But I want you to compare that painting with this painting by Zorn, painted in a brewery. And at this point, I should let you know that Anders Zorn was born out of wedlock because his father was a Bavarian brewer who came up to Sweden one summer, had a short-lived love affair with what becomes Zorn's mother. He never intended to marry her. He vacates and heads back to Bavaria. And when Anders is born, he's raised in this quaint little village, which I've been to, called Mura. And now those who are Swedish in the audience, they'll know how to pronounce it better than I can. But in any case, it's a great place to visit, and you can take these walking trails through the village, and they have all these plaques. This is where Zorn painted this painting, this is where he painted that painting, and so on and so forth. But he never forgot his roots as a brewer, and he continues to court people who become patrons, including Adolphus Busch and Hugo Reisinger, which I'll show you a little later. All right, here is Mrs. Henry White, which used to be in the Corcoran Museum, and now the National Gallery has it. This painting was commissioned. This was one of the very first commissions that wasn't some friend or relative of Sargent's. And he does this painting because the Whites, who are American, they're in Paris, he was a diplomat at the time, they see Lady with a Rose, and they commission Sargent to do this painting. It wins. It's not all that complicated for Sargent. He knocks it off. He has great press. It does well, and it helps him keep moving up the ladder. I love to show that little detail. I took that out of the book from 1970 that Richard Orman wrote, because when I was an undergraduate, my teacher had studied with Clifford Still, and I was doing all these big abstract expressionist paintings. But my teacher had also grown up in Boston, and he was very familiar with Sargent. And so he knew I had an affinity to this guy when I whipped out this brand new book, and I'm going through it, and most of them are black and whites. And I said, what do you think about that? Doesn't it look like a de Kooning or something, except for the hand? And he had to agree. So while Mrs. White was fairly straightforward without too many complications and also garnered very good press reviews by the critics, that cannot be said for this painting. Sargent was completely beguiled by Madame Gautreau, who in fact was an American, somewhat of a social climber. She marries this Frenchman. She thinks Sargent's going to help, because he's been having all this success, propel her up into high society. And likewise, Sargent, who's already sort of beguiled by this unusual beauty and that kind of haughty, striking profile. By the way, she powdered herself heavily with this sort of lavender powder to make herself look more pale. You know, in those days, if you wanted to appear aristocratic, you did not have a tan. That meant you were a peasant and worked in the fields. The more you look like a vampire, the better it was. So Sargent does this incredible, daring, avant-garde thing. He paints her in this, don't forget, this is Victorian times. He paints her this plunging neckline, strap off her shoulder, goes in sort of smug and thinking, because he's had all this great success up to this point. Colossal mistake. And even though he quickly repaints the strap on her shoulder, too little, too late, big scandal, he sort of goes away from Paris with his tail between his legs, almost gives up painting altogether. Richard Orman told me, though, he was so gifted on playing the piano that he could have been a concert pianist if he had chosen that route. Anyway, circling back to Anders Zorn, as I said, he was born out of wedlock in 1860. So he's 4 years younger than Sargent. And unlike Sargent, whose parents were well-to-do, he, of course, grew up in rather humble circumstances. Nevertheless, by age 15, he was already exhibiting this incredible precocious quality for drawing and carving little figures out of wood. So he's enrolled in the Swedish Academy in Stockholm at 15, and he starts excelling in watercolor, and that's just one little study. And he starts selling his watercolors, and he's doing really well. And here are a couple more. And like Sargent, and like a lot of these artists, they would go off. So this is in Stockholm, but he still went to Spain, and these are a couple of his watercolors. Compare that Spanish dancer to the one that I showed you of El Jaleo study. So in 1885, he has fallen in love with the daughter of her name's Emma Lamb, and he's a wealthy businessman. And he wants to prove to her, or to him rather, that he's not going to sort of sponge or live off the fat of the lamb. Excuse the pun, because his name was Lamb, L-A-M-M. So he goes off to Europe. He goes all over Europe, does this whole series of watercolors, sells most of them, comes back with cash in hand, proving that he's a reliable source and he can make his money. And so they wed, and they proceed to go off to exotic Constantinople and spend this great honeymoon where he does this fantastic watercolor of that guy rowing them around. I had a guy, when I had my Fulbright to India, I did a painting that's not wholly unlike this. It's as if you're in the boat, you, the audience, looking at what's behind, and mine happened to be the Ghats, the steppes, and the Ganges. And when I initially did the painting, it didn't have the boat in it. And I saw this painting, and I thought, that's what and so I wiped out the whole foreground, because it would have looked like these two boats would have crashed into each other. And I repainted it completely. And so now mine has this guy rowing me, and you, the viewer, is looking at the rower and then what's behind. So it's not wholly unlike this. There's another beautiful watercolor on the left, painted in Constantinople, and there is his young bride, bearing it all. I want you to remember that pose, because I'm going to show you a Sorolla painting later on that's almost identical to that pose. At this juncture, I feel it's important to mention Peter Krøyer. Those of you who have Scandinavian backgrounds will like that. He was a Danish artist. He's older than Sargent. 1851, 1909 are his dates. And he made an enormous impact, first on Zorn and later on Sorolla. Sorolla, as I said, did a lot. He was heavily influenced by Blasco Ibáñez, the social commentary writer, and he likes paintings like this, a sort of sweatshop scene you see here, where of course these little kids are working in terrible conditions. And Curator was doing paintings like that long before when Sorolla would have been a teenager. And of course, later on, Sorolla becomes famous for those paintings along the seaside in Valencia. So this is not Valencia, this is up in Skagen, one of the islands off the coast in Scandinavia. And of course, here's the Land of the Midnight Sun, one of Curator's most famous paintings. You can probably buy placemats that have an image of this. It's that kind of painting. And here's the Sorolla. That's a large painting, 80 by 78. And it's painted, I chose this particular painting because, of course, you can see it's actually of his wife and his daughter along the seaside. But it was painted in 1909, the same year that Curator died. So, Joaquín Sorolla, the man who's just down the hallway, I hope you have gone to see that exhibition. He was born in 1863 and his sister in 1864. However, in 1865, their parents die in a cholera epidemic. And just fortunately, there was an aunt and uncle who sort of took them in, and they were humble. He was a locksmith. But at age 13, he was so gifted at drawing that they enroll him in some night classes. And then he meets somebody named Antonio Garcia Perez, and he sort of takes Sorolla under his wing and is his sort of protector and patron during his youth, and helps, buys paintings like that, where he was only 15 years old doing that still life there. 18 years old. Look how accomplished that is. He's 18 when he's painting that. So when he paints this painting in 1864, because he had applied for a grant to study in Rome. He had never left Spain at this point, and the judges, the teachers that saw that gave it a unanimous vote, and he's sent off to Rome. And it's also at the same time that he's courting Clotilde, who's the Antonio Garcia's third daughter. Antonio Garcia is the patron. So he ends up, while he's in Rome, he makes a trip, as almost all artists do, to the art capital of the Western world, Paris, and he is painting plein air paintings like this. He's also going in and out of museums, and he comes upon Bastien Lepage paintings. He comes upon Adolphe Menzel's paintings. Alicia will know who that is because he influenced our local hero, William Merritt Chase, because Chase did not study in Paris. He studies in Germany, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later. But anyway, Sorolla continues to enter these competitions, not only in Spain, but also in Germany and France, and he's winning all sorts of awards. He wins a gold medal for this painting. It's called Another Marguerite. It's a social commentary about a woman who is accused of killing her child. And she's being taken off to jail in a railway carriage. Striving for realism, Sorolla actually hires or gets hold of a railway carriage where he paints that painting in the sweat box. Now, at about the same time, there's the Chicago Fair of 1893, and all three artists, Sargent, Zorn, and Sorolla, were all in this. And Zorn, that little watercolor, wins a medal. The much bigger painting, The Waltz, which to the right was bought by George Vanderbilt, who, if you know who George Vanderbilt is, yes, he's of those Vanderbilts, and he builds Biltmore House in Asheville, North Carolina. It's probably, I think it's still the largest private residence in America. It's a chateau. And it's really worth seeing, by the way, if you ever get there. Go at Christmas time. I counted 65 live Christmas trees in that mansion. And anyway, you'll see that painting called The Waltz, and you'll see several Sargent paintings. It's really worth a visit there. So, circling back to Sargent, remember, he's left after this scandal. He leaves Paris. He goes over to England. He settles in a little village in the Cotswolds and my heritage comes from a village just down the road called Upper and Lower Slaughter. But Broadway is where he settles in with Edward Austin Abbey, who's a great painter as well and a great illustrator. And he starts painting these plein air paintings in the very impressionistic manner, because at this point he had also become friends with Monet. And he's working on this painting called Carnation Lily Lily Rose. He paints it not just one summer, because he only paints about 10 minutes a day, and as soon as he's painting it right about dusk. And as soon as that sun goes down, he has to stop. So he comes back to it the next summer. He worked on it so long that he ended up calling it Damnation Silly Silly Pose. But it's shown at the Royal Academy, does really well, and the Tate Museum ends up buying it. So he's done really well with that painting. Here's the painting he does of his good friend Monet painting. By the way, I saw a great exhibition once upon a time at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and they had the painting that Monet's painting hanging right next to the Sargent. So you look at that painting, you say, oh, that looks like Monet. That's the painting of his wife. No, that's Sargent's sister that he's painting that looks like the Monet painting. And a couple of decades later, there's Sorolla painting his daughter, also with that impressionistic kind of palette and the dappled sunlight. Large painting, too, 6 feet tall. So another favorite of mine, which is further down the road in Brooklyn, is this Sargent painting of another fellow artist, a great painter actually, is Paul Hellieu and his wife. I like that dynamic, starting at sort of the top right corner, coming through the canoe, coming across the top of the canvas, sort of circling back in and ends up around that straw hat, circulating around the straw hat, and there is Sargent in his straw hat painting the painting that you just saw, and there's a detail of it. Compare this to this painting by Zorn. Similar composition, you're coming down the road, dynamic, a diagonal comes in upon this poor inebriated soul who's crashed out on the lawn, and his wife, presumably his wife, is with his hat in her hands, waiting for him to get up from his drunken stupor. I found that painting not in Zorn's home. This painting was hanging in the courthouse in Mura, and I decided this must be his one and only sort of social commentary painting, because Zorn was a heavy drinker. Okay, although the female nude was a staple of 19th century art and art academies, for the most part, the female nude was either painted indoors or in art classes, and sometimes it was painted like a femme fatale. Just think of Olympia by Manet, or you think of Courbet, the way he would paint nudes. Or if it was painted like an angel or a nymph, that would be by one of those neo-classicists like Bouguereau or Cabanel. But it was really Zorn who, now as historians have said this, is credited with painting or sort of modernizing the nude in her natural beauty and out in the great outdoors in her birthday suit. And there, two more. That little painting on the left, I just wish I could paint like that. Oh, the painting on the right was bought by Charles Deering, who is a dear friend of Sargent's. And if you know Vizcaya down in Miami, it's a great place to visit. It's really beautiful. Sargent went and painted there. And I'll show you a painting he did of Charles Deering a little later on. All right, so Sorolla, circling back to him, he's painting on the beach in Valencia, and this is a little 18 by 24-inch painting, study, but when it's blown up to 8 by 13 feet, it made a significant impact on the judges of the French Salon of 1895, where it wins a gold medal. And it was purchased by the French government, and today it is hanging on the second floor of the Musée d'Orsay. If you know that museum, you know that giant clock that's up there. It hangs almost just opposite the clock. At least it was when I was there in 2019. There's just a beautiful detail of it. Gosh. And a couple more of all the sailors. So at the same time, Sorolla still continues his social commentary paintings, and this is the one that's called and they still say fish is expensive. It's really about, what can happen to these guys? Fish is expensive. Why? Because it's a very dangerous occupation. People falling overboard, drowning, they're getting hooked. Probably that's what's happened to this young chap here. Now, I much prefer this little painting. It's not very big, but this wins a gold medal in Berlin, and I just think it's a real tour de force. How he handles that water, right down to the wetness of the pants of the guys and the fishing nets, and everything about that painting adds up to a home run. When I was living and teaching in Los Angeles, I went down to the San Diego Museum. They had in 1989, they had a huge Sorolla retrospective. And I stood for about 20 minutes transfixed in front of this painting. I just was completely blown away. I mean, like half the painting is this tour de force, sort of Errol Flynn swashbuckling his way on that sail. It's called Sewing the Sail, and it's just all discombobulated and crazy. But and I was surprised later to read that this wasn't really accepted very well, didn't garner good press at that time, and maybe because it was just a little too, far afield or avant-garde or whatever you want to call it. The critics didn't get it, but I loved it. So at this point, Sargent and Sorolla had become great friends. Sorolla is working on what's going to become his last great, big, really prominent painting, a social commentary painting called Sad Inheritance. This is a study for it, which he gives to Sargent. Sargent reciprocates and gives him a painting, and when they both died, their paintings, they had kept them in their, they never sold them, and never got rid of them, never gave them to anybody. They were found in their studios upon their death. So here's Sad Inheritance, which proved to be a very powerful painting, won numerous awards throughout Europe and abroad. And yet, while he was working on it, Sorolla became so saddened by these crippled children and just, what it was all about, that he decided he would never paint anything remotely like it again. He'd much rather paint scenes like this. And even though they're peasants, he just reveled in that dappled sunlight. I love the way the reason I like that Sewing the Sail, I like it for the same reason I love that figure in the foreground coming out with those warm and cool play of color across the white shirt. In a relative painting to that called Packing Raisins, I was immediately struck by a painting that I remembered seeing a long time ago of Sargent's, and I searched it out, called Venetian Bead Stringers, because it's one of the paintings he painted in Venice. And it's this painting here. It's that sort of abstract streak of sunlight that comes up there. Let me go back. This same diagonal, strong streak of light coming across in 1901. This is pretty avant-garde stuff happening, And there it is. And you can really see that Sorolla was influenced by Sargent. Now I'd like you to compare these two formal portraits where these gentlemen have their hats in their hand. And there is Hugo Reisinger, he's a brewer. And of course, they courted Zorn because they knew he had come from this background, and then Baruti happened to be a good friend of Sorolla's. He was a really well-known social critic of the day. He was an accomplished landscape painter. That's one of his paintings in the background. His dates, by the way, are 1845 to 1912, so he's older. He's sort of the father figure of Sorolla in a sense. And he happened to be the judge of the 1899 exposition in Paris in 1899, where he awards Sad Inheritance, the one with the little crippled kids, the grand prize for the entire exhibition. And it's pretty amazing that he wins the grand prize when the other prize winners happen to be Sargent, Zorn, Kreuer, and Alma Tadema. Those of you who know art history know that he could paint marble like nobody else. And Alan Funt cornered the market on Tadema's paintings. He bought them all up at one point. So now we come to I'll let Alicia take over, or Fred Baker. He's in the audience as well. Fred Baker worked with Ron Pisano, who was he worked at the parish or was the head of the parish at one point, and they worked on the catalog raisonné of William Merritt Chase. That great portrait by Sargent was commissioned by Chase's students. And you think, Chase's student, well, he was internationally, well, he was as well known as being a teacher. And since I was a teacher for 40 years, I like to have, think that I could hold court with this guy, although I couldn't. But in any case, he was a great, great teacher, and his students commissioned him. If you know the art village right down the road here, Chase was talked into coming out, and he started the first plein air painting school, the summer school in America in 1891. And we live about a mile and a half from there. All those little cottages across from the smoke shops of the Shinnecock Indian Reservation, there's one of the cottages before they added on to it where I got to meet the Benjamins when I first moved here in 1993. I just went up and knocked on the door because I didn't know anything about Long Island University, but I knew a lot about the history of art out here. And the Benjamins invited me in, and they said, "Would you like a scotch?" And I said, "Sure." And then they took me through, and I saw all these great places that not Sargent, but Chase used to take his students during inclement weather. Instead of painting outdoors, they would paint in this studio. Well, anyway, the reason I am showing Thomas Moran by Chase, the next painting to the right there with the beard, and his dates are 1837 to 1926. He lived a long time. He was an Englishman, but he moves to America when he's young, about 7 years old. They settle at one point in East Hampton, and they both become famous, as you know, Chase and Moran. Moran becomes famous because he goes out west in the 1870s. He does these little studies, comes back east, paints this enormous painting called Grand Canyon at the Yellowstone, takes it down to Washington, D.C., shows it along with the Geological Survey team, to these senators and congressmen, most of whom hadn't been across the Mississippi River. They see this painting, and they see these little crummy black and white photographs, and they look at that painting, and they look at the photographs, and then they decide, well, they will declare it as has to be preserved for posterity, and that becomes our first national park, Yellowstone, all because of an Englishman who comes to America and paints it. Well, I'm going to do a lecture next year on both Chase and Moran, and I hope you'll come, and I hope I'll have it here. So in the same year, having had very good success with Carnation Lily Rose, Sargent is introduced by his good friend, the expatriate writer Henry James, to high society. And because now he's living in England, and Henry James is an expatriate living in England. So after Sargent does this great painting, which is hanging in the Edinburgh Gallery of Art, and I used to live and teach up in England, right at the border, and I had a gallery representing me in Edinburgh. I used to always go and stare lovingly at this painting. And he wins great praise at the Royal Academy, and because of this painting, he starts courting high society. They start lining up around the block to come and have their portrait painted by Sargent. I want to just read here. The London Times called it, quote, a masterpiece, not only a triumph of technique, but the finest example of portraiture in the literal sense of the word that has been seen here in a long while. The confident and spontaneous looking broad brushstrokes coupled with the subtle harmony of nuanced color within this beautiful face, dress, and lavender sash produce an overall effect that is so eloquently assured it appears effortless. And that, my friends, is why Sargent was known as the Van Dyck of our times. And that was a label that Auguste Rodin, the famous sculptor, had bestowed upon Sargent, calling him the Van Dyck of our times. So throughout the 1890s, up through the first part of the 20th century, Sargent was in high demand for high society portraits. And Sorolla and Zorn weren't too far behind either. They were sort of picking up the scraps, as it were. But no, that's not true, because they were painting the high society of Spain or Sweden or Paris or wherever. But Sargent was primarily painting them in America and in England. Anyway, Zorn, as I had mentioned earlier, is very competitive. He's always trying to outdo Sargent, and he does this painting in 1900, but I think he looks like he's looking at that much more complicated painting that's also a lot larger painting of Sargent's, Mrs. Carl Mayer and her children. But look, she's seated with her feet crossed, her arms extended across the couch. She's holding an oriental fan, same thing that Zorn does. So Zorn, I think, is really looking a lot at Sargent at this time. That competitive streak, I don't ever see it in Sorolla. I mean, this is a painting of his daughter. Incidentally, this painting, when I went to the retrospective in 1989 at the San Diego Museum of Art, I was told this was the first painting they bought for their collection from Sorolla. And I'm showing it mainly because it's tall and narrow, just like the Duchess of Portland, but that's a formal portrait. They shouldn't really be compared, is one better or not. That isn't the way you should look at it. However, you can compare these two. This is the one painting in which Zorn's competitiveness wins out over Sargent, because he's on a trip. You notice that the Sargent to the left, same person, and this painting is also hanging in the Biltmore House in Asheville, North Carolina, and was bought by, or actually commissioned by, the cousin of Mrs. Rathbone Bacon, George Vanderbilt. So anyway, Sargent had already done that in a Spanish costume. Well, Mr. Bacon didn't really like it, and he happens to run, just by accident, he runs into Zorn on a ship going back to Europe, and he commissions him. He doesn't just commission him, he challenges Zorn to do a better painting of his wife. And Zorn just rose to the challenge. He does this, he even breaks out the blue, because he's always doing these paintings and using his famous limited palette, which was this, I think it was lamp black, vermilion red, yellow ochre, and a white, which I think was zinc white. David, would that be right? Okay. Well, anyway, I read that somewhere once upon a time, but it's amazing what he can do with such few colors. But in this case, he breaks out the blue too, and he does this painting. It wins, does well when it's exhibited. The Bacons are appreciative of it, and Sargent even says, "Mr. Zorn has won a brilliant victory." That, I tell you, Zorn just was all falling all over himself, because now he could step out from the long shadow cast by Sargent to join the ranks and paint high society. Nevertheless, 2 years later in 1899, Sargent paints this grandiose portrait of the Wyndham sisters, which even included a portrait, albeit recessed, as you can see, in the shadows of their mother, painted a couple of decades earlier by George Frederick Watts. By the way, Richard Orman was the head of the Watts Gallery, which you can tour in Surrey, England. Anyway, that painting, which hangs at the Metropolitan Museum, is one, according to the London Times, they hailed the Wyndham sisters as, quote, "the greatest picture of modern times." And modern times means 1899, 1901. They counted among their friends Henry James, Oscar Wilde, Edward Burns Jones, and one of the sisters, Mary, also had a long-lasting love affair with Arthur Balfour, the Prime Minister. So around the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, Sargent's just tired of hearing the expression. In fact, he once upon a time, when people say, "Well, what is a portrait? What do you like about portraits?" And he says, "I don't like portraits. A portrait is a painting where there's something not quite right about the mouth." So anyway, he tires of painting portraits, and he starts cutting back. In fact, what he does, there was a great show, 2019. In fact, I invited Richard Orman to come over. It was at the Morgan Gallery, of these charcoals. He starts doing charcoals because he can knock them off in just a few hours instead of these paintings, which can take a week or longer, or sometimes months. Anyway, he's doing these paintings, which are very expressionistically handled. There's a freedom to them. He'll do watercolors, as you see on the bottom, almost the same scene as at the top, and there's a detail of it. And this painting, which is one of my very favorite, of his nieces, called The Brook, talking about tour de force, talking about Errol Flynn's swashbuckling. But one of my very favorites, which doubles as painting out of doors on location, but also it's 8 feet wide, is this painting he does as a commission for a chap named McCullough. McCullough likes to fly fish. He takes Zorn up to Norway where they go salmon fishing, and Sargent doesn't care about fishing. He's sketching his son. And anyway, long story short, he ends up with this composition here. I want you to note that sort of pinkish salmon-y color going across the water. It's in the rocks, it's in his shirt, it's even in the fish. Look at this painting by Zorn. That pinkish color's in the water, it's in the rocks, it's in the flesh. Both of them are from Scandinavia. It makes me wonder about the light up there. Having said that, now let's go back down to Spain, sunny Spain, where Sorolla is doing a whole bunch of paintings like this. And what's so incredible, he's known as the painter of sunlight. Just look at what happens just between his armpit. Here, let me point it out. The cool tones, the warm tones, why does that happen? Because the armpit's reflecting the light coming off his body. It could be coming off his hip, it could be bouncing off the warm of the somewhere else. But then this coolish tone, or this kind of tone, or this sort of lavender tone you see through here or there, it's coming from the sky. It's coming from the sea. It's all this light bouncing and refracting off the sea. Look what he does here, 1905. It's damn hard. And he's painting these from life. These aren't from photographs. This one's even better. Now that's avant-garde painting, and a long time before David Hockney painted the swimming pool series. This one's 6 feet across, and this painting by Sorolla, just look what it's avant-garde, and that painting's 1910, so you start thinking about Cubism coming in 1910, but at this moment in time, Sorolla is more famous and more revered than Picasso. You look at this painting and you say, that couldn't have been painted on the beach. It's 80 by 98 inches. Voila. Need I say more? So I will. These two, or three, I've been to that place called San Vilio. That's on Lake Garda. It used to be a private residence. Churchill painted there when it was a private residence, but now it's a hotel and one can go there and luxuriate and pretend you're painting. They still have that kind of horseshoe-shaped harbor there. But look, the palette, the handling of the brush, it's almost like when Picasso and Braque are painting, you can't tell one from the other. It's the same thing here. Or look here. Here he is painting, he being Sorolla, painting his wife and daughters in the garden where the paintings down the hallway were painted. Here's Sargent's painting, which lives at the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It's one of my favorites, painting in the loggia. And there are details showing up close and personal, especially at this scale. It's pretty nice. I love this painting, but I decided I couldn't cut it when I was making all these cuts to what I could show you to try to keep it down to an hour. I don't even know where we are. But that he makes a postcard of it and he sends it to his friend Sorolla, wishing him Happy New Year. So you can see here that Sorolla is indeed the painter of sunlight. And what I happen to like about both of these, and it's not like he just did two like this, he often would utilize very cleverly that drapery to kind of juxtapose against the figures. In the one on the right is kind of a cool tone. The one on the left, it's very warm. But I think it's really clever, and that's thinking abstractly. And those abstract streaks of light going across those two on the right, that's thinking abstractly. All three of these artists painted in the Alhambra, and I painted in the Alhambra about 100 years later in 1983. Not quite like that, but I painted in the gardens. But anyway, and I was just there in 2019. I took my better half, Jeanette, there. They also painted in Venice, all three of them. That's a great painting by Zorn. Love that painting. And that little paint, look how little that painting is, 9 by 12 inches. It holds up to a big scale. And there are the de Glens again, sitting in the gondola just in front of where Sargent is seated, which you notice it's roped up to each other. There's the painting by Sorolla. Remember the painting that Zorn had done of his wife called The Tub, where she was doing something like this? Very, very similar pose. And I love that Zorn on the right, where you don't see the fire, but you see the effects of the fire on their bodies. Anybody recognize this chap? Everybody, some of you who know art well, this was shown not too long ago in I think it might even be in the Hispanic Society, but in any case, everybody knows who Tiffany is, and everybody thinks of the stained glass, but in fact, he was a painter. There are some very good paintings of his in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. So, living life large, Zorn kind of blew up. He drank heavily, he smoked heavily, he ate heavily, sort of like Churchill. By the age of 55, when he paints himself in this flaming Santa Claus suit, he is not long for this world. By the age 60, he suffers a major heart attack and promptly dies. So there's a painting of him in his studio from 1910, and then 2015 when I was visiting, and there's a nice little painting coming down the stairs in his home. And then astride his steed in World War I, 1917, and then almost 100 years later, 2015, showing one of his carved figurines. I love this isn't very large, but look at the determination in Sorolla's face there. So in 1908, Sorolla mounts this big show in London, and he meets Archer Huntington. Huntington's father was one of the guys who built the railroad across America. And if you know the Huntington Gardens out west and the Research Library and Museum, they're related. In any case, Archer Huntington also opens the Hispanic Society Museum. So he buys this painting you see here, which is also in the Hispanic Society Museum to this day. And he commissions Sorolla to come and do a big solo show in 1909. He buys 26 of the paintings. Sorolla does this show. Let me just read these statistics. He displays 356 paintings. 170,000 people come to this exhibition in 1909. It then goes on from Buffalo to Boston. By the end of the run, Sorolla had sold 195 paintings. He made 181,760. It doesn't sound much by today's standards. Eric Fischl sells a painting for $1 million. But in those days, 181,000 was a vast fortune. And he gets to paint the portrait of President Taft because he had become so internationally famous. Then Huntington, in 1911, commissions Sorolla. He says, go back to Spain. I want you to paint the vision of Spain. It's going to be a mural. It's going to hang in this huge room. The walls are 45 feet long, or longer than 45 feet. That's how long that one wall is. And that's a number of panels. So he goes back. He paints these on location all over Spain. Here are several more. He starts in 1911. He works all the way through 1919. In addition to doing portraits, in addition to painting people on the beach, in addition to painting the paintings that are just down the hallway, in the galleries, I should say. So this is the last one he paints in 1919. And unfortunately, by 1920, by the way, there are 3 or 4 of them that are dated 1918, 1919. You're looking at some of the last paintings Sorolla ever painted, because he has this stroke in 1920, never paints again. He dies also at age 60 in 1923. That picture with my daughter admiring the big Sorolla painting I showed you earlier, a discerning eye, look to the left. Mind you, this picture was taken years ago of my daughter looking at that painting. If you've been to the show down the hallway, see those 3 paintings? They're in the show. So after you leave here, go on down and see them again. Now, I could have ended it there. However, Sargent outlives them by 9 years, so he's still occasionally doing portraits. He doesn't like doing them except for friends. And this one of Henry James, some of his rich friends come, and Henry James is very famous and very wealthy at this point. This is for his 70th birthday. Sargent does this great, great portrait of him. He's paid the money. He feels guilty about accepting it. He then goes and buys these fancy antique dishes, which he gives to Henry, and he commissions a sculptor to do a marble bust, and that's his birthday gift to Henry James. He also is commissioned not once, not twice, 5 times to paint John D. Rockefeller. He only does 2 paintings. And because it's during World War I, he forgives the fee for at least one of them, and he gives that to the Red Cross. And the painting on the right is his good friend. It's a little painting. The one on the left is a sort of a formal portrait. But the one on the right is, as you can see, it's a little painting. What a tour de force, though. That little painting's in the Chicago Art Institute as well, and that's painted in Vizcaya down in Miami, or Coral Gables, I think. Now, World War I makes a profound impact upon Sargent. And why? Because his niece, Rosemarie's husband, joins the good fight and is one of the first to be killed in 1914 at the front. Just 4 years later, that beautiful niece that you saw in the brook lying down, she's in a church in Paris, and one of those long-range guns bombs this church in Paris, and she's killed. So the British War Memorials Committee tapped Sargent and also Augustus John and also William Orpen to come up with a supersized painting documenting the war. And what Sargent initially does is he goes, oh, by the way, when World War I breaks out, he's painting in the Austrian Tyrol. So he's in enemy territory. He has to escape, and he makes his way back up to London. But he's doing initially these little watercolor studies, and I love this one right here. If you look, I mean, it even has the water. Let me just get my little pointer here. Look at the sense of the water, the weight of the water taking that tarp down. And over here we have a chap, one of the soldiers, underneath the tarp. Well, the Augustus John and William Orpen, who had painted this great, they'd done little studies, but they didn't do the big painting. Sargent does, and it becomes this painting, Gassed. And it really just bowls them over. And what's interesting, it's not about the heroes. It's not about fighting. It's about the guys who have been compromised from the mustard gas. It's about the blind leading the blind. And I like to think, and here's a couple of details, I think symbolically, Sargent seems to pose the question in Gassed, how can mankind be so blinded by waging war again and again and again? Don't they see the insanity of war? No, because these guys, who are usually older, the generals, are what get these young guys into war, who get them killed. It's always the young guys that get killed in the wars. Well, so following that supersized painting Gassed, he's also commissioned to paint this almost equally large. Gassed is 20 feet. This is 17 and something inches feet. And there is Commander Haig. He's the commander-in-chief of all the World War I soldiers. He's the one who's astride the stage as you're going from Trafalgar Square down to Big Ben on his horse. And here he is. So how Sargent did this painting is he painted every single one of those generals from life, doing these little 22 by 16-inch paintings. Now that one of Field Marshal Haig, I got to know his son, Dwight Haig, because I was living and teaching in England. He lived in Beamerside. It's a sort of family castle just outside of Edinburgh, and I used to exhibit in Edinburgh. He became an artist. I was lucky to have met him. He was lucky to be alive. During World War II, now, this is the son, not Commander Haig, because he was long since dead. Dwight Haig was captured in North Africa. Hitler had him sent to Colditz Castle, where he had all the royals sent that were captured in World War II. Just before Hitler puts that Luger in his mouth and shoots himself, he calls up the council and tells the guards, kill all those British bastards, which thankfully they did not do, and which is why I got to know Dwight Haig. So I'm sitting in Beamer's side in this chair thinking, well, you know, Winston Churchill sat here. George V, the King of England, sat here. You know, somebody else famous Sargent sat over there, or William Orpen, or whatever. Well, my last slide, you've been very patient, shows a couple of pictures of Sargent's studio at Tite Street, which he got originally from Whistler. Whistler had to sell it. That's a whole nother story, where he sues Ruskin. You may know the story. I can tell you that in another lecture. And there's my friend, Julian Barrow. I met him in the 80s when I was teaching in England. And of course, he had been living there since the 60s. And I think, if memory serves me well, he bought it from Augustus John, because Augustus John got it after Sargent had passed away. And what's behind him, that big gold frame thing and those velvet curtains, those were up in the day when Sargent used to do his portraits. And he would pull those open. That's north light, and then the light would fall upon the subject. Well, less than 2 months after I took this picture in 2013, he died of a brain aneurysm. And he was a painter who went all over the world. He was in India, he would paint in Angkor Wat. He'd go to these really far off, removed places, and he would show in London, and he'd show in Bombay, and he'd show in New York, and all of that. He was a really great mostly little paintings, but he painted portraits as well. Thank you very much. You've been very... If you have any questions, I could attempt to answer them. I'm not promising I could answer them, but I could attempt to. About anything you saw or would have liked to have seen? Time's up.
Just keep us posted on your next talk.
Okay, thanks.